In the vast, dusty archives of American crime, where stories of transgression are meticulously catalogued with dates, names, and evidence, there exist other, darker narratives. These are the tales defined not by what was found, but by what is chillingly absent. In the early years of the 20th century, the deep, shadowed hollows of West Virginia were a world apart, a labyrinth of ancient ridges and plunging valleys governed by a code of brutal self-reliance and the whims of an unforgiving landscape. These mountains, the time-worn spine of the continent, are among the oldest on Earth, their brooding presence a constant, silent witness to the fleeting dramas of human life. Their age provided shelter, but it also enforced a profound, almost suffocating isolation. It was a geological and social reality that bred a unique and powerful kind of silence. For some, this quiet was a source of profound peace, a respite from the clamor of a rapidly changing world. But for others, it became a culture medium for a darkness that festers unseen, a malignancy thriving in the deep shadows of a single, secluded family cabin, hidden from any judging eyes. This silence could nurture a family, but as one family would discover, it could also become its tomb. The story of the Hollister family isn't etched into any official history. You will not find it meticulously cross-referenced in the brittle, yellowed pages of newspaper archives or buried deep within the heavy, leather-bound ledgers of county court records. There is no faded case file, no docket number, no stark, black-and-white photograph of the accused staring blankly into the camera's lens. The narrative exists only in the ephemeral, yet paradoxically enduring, architecture of oral tradition. It is a mosaic, pieced together from cautionary tales told by grandparents to keep restless children from wandering too far into the woods after dusk, but one with a terrifyingly, tragically human heart. A local historian, Dr. Eleanor Vance, a woman who has dedicated her life to capturing and preserving these vanishing Appalachian narratives before they fade completely, explains why a story like this survives with such chilling tenacity. Written records document facts, she explains, her voice a careful, measured cadence, but oral traditions document feelings, fears, and moral boundaries. They are the emotional ledger of a community. A story like the Hollisters, which grapples with an ultimate, foundational taboo, becomes a map of social and psychological dangers. It's not just a scary story told around a fire, it's a piece of psychological cartography, a chart of the most treacherous waters of the human soul. It is a visceral warning, carved directly into the community's collective mind, about what happens when a family's world shrinks to the size of a single cabin, when they are left alone with nothing but their own unprocessed grief. The story is a lesson, passed down through generations, about the abyss that can open up when profound love and profound duty become hideously twisted into something unrecognizable and monstrous. It's a testament to the fact that the most terrible secrets don't need to be written down to be remembered. They stain the land itself. The family tree of the Hollisters takes root around the year 1923, in a place the locals called Black Fork Hollow. This designation was not found on any official map, it was a name known only to the few families who called that particular fold in the mountains of Boone County, West Virginia, their home. This wasn't a town or even a village. It was a geographical pocket, a handful of fiercely self-sufficient homesteads scattered miles apart, connected by little more than meandering deer trails and the shared experience of deep, abiding isolation. A place with a general store, a post office, and the semblance of law in the form of a sheriff, was a grueling 2-day trip by mule over treacherous, rocky terrain. It was a journey undertaken perhaps twice a year for essentials like salt, sugar, coffee, and faint, distorted news from an outside world that felt as impossibly distant and abstract as a foreign country. Deep within this hollow, where the ridges pressed in close and the creek ran dark and cold over smooth stones, lived the Hollister family. The patriarch was Jedediah Hollister, a man described in the fragmented memories of his contemporaries as being as weathered and unyielding as the ancient land itself. He was a man of few words, his hands calloused and shaped by the axe and the plow, his thoughts turned inward. His strength was legendary. It was said he could fell a century-old oak with an unnerving precision that spoke of a lifetime spent battling the wilderness into a state of grudging submission. His wife, Elara, was his opposite in nearly every way, the quiet, beating heart of their secluded home. Decades later, in a recorded oral history project from the 1970s, a neighbor from an adjacent hollow, Martha Crow, recalled her. Her voice, thin and reedy with age, cracks with a distant but vivid memory. Oh, Elara was the gentle one. The light. Jedediah was the rock, but she was the water that flows around it. She knew all the old ways, all the herbs for healing, yarrow for fevers, jewelweed for poison ivy, plantain for bee stings. She had a song for every chore and a story for every season. She was the one who held that family together, not with force, but with song and spirit. The music of that cabin, the life of it, came from her. When she went, the music went with her. The whole hollow felt it, like a string on a fiddle just snapping in the middle of the center of their tightly knit world. The two sons, Caleb and Isaac, were strong boys, already learning the hard, unforgiving lessons of the land from their father. They knew how to read the sky for weather, how to track a deer for miles, how to live by the rhythms of the seasons. Then there was the toddler, Sarah, the cherished baby of the family, coddled and adored. And finally, their eldest, 16-year-old Willow. By all accounts, Willow possessed a rare combination of her father's quiet, formidable resilience and her mother's gentle, watchful nature. The mountain was her entire world. She knew its moods, its dangers, and its hidden beauties with an intimacy born of a lifetime spent within its embrace. Life was a relentless cycle of hard labor, planting, harvesting, chopping wood, preserving food, but it was a life that held moments of simple, profound beauty, the vibrant, impossible green of the forest after a spring rain, the sweet, sharp taste of wild blackberries warm from the sun, or the long, silent winter nights huddled together around the massive stone hearth, listening to Elara's stories, safe and warm and together. They believed their family bond was a fortress, a bulwark against the vast, indifferent wilderness that surrounded them on all sides. They believed it was unbreakable. The winter of 1924 was not just a season, it was a siege. It descended upon Black Fork Hollow not with the gentle grace of falling snow, but with the fury of an invading army. A series of relentless blizzards buried the mountains under a crushing, monolithic blanket of ice and snow, sealing the Hollisters off from what little connection they had to the outside world. The narrow trails vanished. The world shrank, its horizons contracting with each passing day until their entire existence was contained within the four rough-hewn log walls. In the suffocating heart of this forced confinement, that tragedy struck with a brutal, indifferent finality. Elara fell ill. It began as a simple cough, a common affliction in the damp chill of the mountain winter. But this was different. It deepened, settling in her chest like a stone, each breath becoming a painful, rattling struggle for air. Her fever burned hot, stealing her strength and leaving her weak and delirious, trapped in a terrifying world between waking and nightmare. A local physician from that era, Dr. Alastair Finch, years later reviewed the sparse, third-hand accounts of her illness for a study on early 20th century Appalachian medicine. His clinical assessment gives a cold, modern name to their desperate, primitive terror. The symptoms described, a rapid onset of high fever, chest pain, a productive cough, and eventual delirium, are entirely consistent with a severe case of bacterial pneumonia, what they often called winter fever or lung fever back then. In a place like Black Fork Hollow, with no access to a doctor, no sulfa drugs, no modern medicine of any kind, it was almost always a death sentence. Their folk remedies, while perhaps comforting and psychologically significant, would have been utterly powerless against such an aggressive infection. Jedediah and Willow fought the illness with every tool in their limited arsenal. They brewed teas from pine needles and elderberries, pungent concoctions that filled the small cabin with their sharp, medicinal scent. They made poultices of mustard and onion, hoping to draw the sickness out. But the mountain passes were buried under 10 feet of snow. No help was coming. Jedediah, a man who could wrestle life from the stubborn soil and face down any predator in the woods, was rendered utterly, agonizingly helpless as he watched the love of his life fade away before his eyes. Willow, just a girl of 16, found herself thrust into a role she was never meant for. Her mother's duties, running the household, caring for her terrified younger siblings, and tending to Elara with a tireless, desperate hand that never rested, her own fear and grief pushed aside by the urgent needs of the dying. Ilara died on a bitter, wind-scoured morning in late January. The ground outside was frozen solid, as hard as iron, making a burial impossible. Following a grim but necessary mountain tradition, Jedediah and his eldest son, Caleb, wrapped her frail, wasted body in her finest hand-stitched quilt. They placed her in a simple pine box Jedediah had constructed with trembling hands, and carried her to the cold, silent darkness of the barn, to wait for the spring thaw and a proper burial. Ilara's death was not just a loss, it was the collapse of their universe. The cabin's warmth, its light, its very soul, seemed to die with her. Jedediah, the unshakable patriarch, the rock of the family, crumbled into a ghost of himself. He would sit for hours, staring into the fire, his powerful hands limp in his lap, the strength gone from them as if the lifeblood had drained out of him. And in the center of this fractured, grieving world stood Willow, a child forced to become the matriarch overnight, her own girlhood ending the moment her mother's life did. The profound isolation of their homestead, which had once felt protective and peaceful, now felt like a crushing, suffocating weight. With Ilara gone, the family's delicate balance was irrevocably destroyed, leaving a dangerous, gaping void that grief alone could not fill. When spring finally arrived, its tentative warmth melting the snow and coaxing green life back into the valley, they buried Ilara on a small, grassy hill overlooking the homestead she had so lovingly tended. But for Jedediah, the thaw never came. He remained frozen in his grief, a man adrift in a bottomless, silent sea of sorrow, bore the entire, crushing weight of the household on her young shoulders. She cooked, she cleaned, she tended the garden, and she mothered her younger siblings, her own grief necessarily buried beneath the endless, relentless list of daily chores required for their survival. Lost in the labyrinth of his sorrow, Jedediah began to depend on her for everything. But his dependence soon curdled into something else, something unhealthy and strange. His grieving mind, shattered by the loss of his wife, began to blur the lines between the woman he had lost and the daughter who so powerfully remained. He saw Ilara in the way Willow moved through the cabin, in the deft, familiar way she kneaded bread or stoked the fire. He heard Ilara's voice in the soft way she hummed to baby Sarah to soothe her crying. In his broken psyche, his daughter, the living, breathing girl before him, slowly ceased to be his daughter. In the suffocating fog of his trauma, she became a ghostly, living replacement for his dead wife. The absolute, profound isolation of Black Fork Hollow was a key conspirator in the horror that unfolded. Months passed without them seeing another living soul. There were no neighbors to drop by with a pie and a comforting word, no church service to attend where a sermon might steady a wavering moral compass, no community to gently reinforce the sacred boundaries and social norms that govern human behavior. There were no outside eyes to register the creeping wrongness, the subtle but profound shift in the atmosphere of the Hollister cabin. The family had become an island, a nation of one, with its own broken king ruling over a kingdom of sorrow. The final, sacred boundary was crossed on a suffocatingly humid summer night, the air thick and still with the sound of crickets and the cloying scent of honeysuckle. Brutal violence, which in some ways might have been easier to comprehend. It was something far more insidious, something born of a shared, desperate loneliness and a fundamental line being erased in the suffocating haze of unbearable grief. It was a sin of confusion, of desperation, of a world that had shrunk to a single, shared, sorrowful space where two lonely people clung to each other in the dark. From that night on, a new and terrible silence fell over the cabin, one born not of sorrow, but of corrosive, unspoken shame. Willow was trapped, a prisoner of her father's bottomless grief and her own crushing sense of duty. Months later, the irreversible consequence of the act became terrifyingly clear: she was pregnant. When Jedediah was faced with the undeniable, growing proof of his transgression, he didn't confess or seek forgiveness, he simply retreated further into himself, pulling the walls of their isolation even tighter around them. They concocted a thin, desperate story for the younger children, telling them that Willow was sick with a swelling sickness, a vague ailment that the children, living in their own world of confused fear and loss, did not question. She gave birth in the dead of winter, the very same season that had stolen her mother just 2 years prior, a cruel symmetry that did not go unnoticed. The baby was a boy she named Samuel, a secret born into a house of secrets. He was hidden away in the dusty loft, his infant cries muffled by the very quilts his grandmother had sewn, a living, breathing symbol of a truth too terrible to acknowledge. Years passed. The lie became the foundation of their lives, a rotten beam supporting the entire structure of their existence. 4 years later, Willow was pregnant again, this time with a girl they named Lily. The cabin was now a prison of lies, its air thick with unspoken words and constantly averted gazes. Isaac and Sarah grew up in this poisoned atmosphere. They knew, in the intuitive way that children know things without being told, that something was fundamentally and irrevocably broken. Their once strong father was a hollowed-out ghost, prone to long, brooding silences and sudden, inexplicable fits of temper. Their vibrant older sister was perpetually sad, a shadow of the girl she once was, her youth stolen from her. Whispers finally started to drift up from the other hollows and out to the nearest settlements. Men trading pelts or buying supplies would talk in hushed tones. "Something ain't right with the Hollisters since Alara passed," they'd say. "Jedediah, he looks haunted. And that girl, Willow, she looks older than her own father." They were right. The family was rotting from the inside out, consumed by the secret it was forced to keep. By the time Samuel was 18, around the year 1943, the secret was no longer a passive entity. It was a monstrous, living presence in the cabin, shaping every interaction, poisoning every meal, silencing every potential laugh. Samuel had grown into a quiet, unnervingly intense young man who had spent his entire life shrouded in a gnawing, ever-present sense of wrongness. He saw how other families interacted at the rare community gatherings or at the distant trading post, how their laughter was easy and their relationships were clearly, simply defined. His own home, by stark contrast, was a place of deep shadows, coded language, and constantly averted eyes. He was called Willow's son, but Jedediah, the man everyone called his grandfather, treated him with a bizarre, unsettling mixture of paternal affection and sudden, inexplicable splintered clues for years. The different ink and handwriting used for his and Lily's names in the heavy family Bible, entered long after the others, the simple, damning arithmetic that his mother, Willow, was only 16 years older than him, the looks of deep pity he sometimes saw in the eyes of the few outsiders they encountered, and the terrifying, gaping void where a father should be. The story he was told, that his father was a traveling worker who had passed through and died, felt thin and brittle, a story designed to conceal rather than explain. The breaking point came, as it so often did in that place, during another harsh, isolating winter. Samuel, confined to the cabin by a blizzard that raged for days, was in the loft, mending a leather strap. Down below, by the flickering fire, he overheard his mother and Jedediah arguing. It was a rare event, their shared shame usually kept them in a state of silent, mutual torment. But 2 decades of repressed pain, guilt, and sorrow were finally boiling over. Willow's voice was raw, stripped of everything but pure agony. "It was a sin, Jedediah, and we are living in its shadow every single day. Look at him. He's a man now. He has your eyes and he knows something is wrong. He feels it in his bones. We cannot keep this lie forever." And then Jedediah's voice, a low, defeated rumble like stone grinding on stone, uttered the words that would shatter their world into a million pieces. "He is my son. You are my daughter. God have mercy on my soul." The words floated up through the floorboards and detonated Samuel's world. Grandfather. Father. Mother. Sister. The words, the very pillars of his identity, violently rearranged themselves into a grotesque, unspeakable configuration. He felt a wave of profound nausea and vertigo, the floor beneath him seeming to tilt in the loft, his face a mask of pale, horrified understanding. Willow saw him and let out a choked, guttural sob, a sound she had held back for 20 agonizing years. Jedediah stared at Samuel, his own son-grandson, and for a moment, the mask of the stoic patriarch fell away completely, revealing a face of bottomless self-loathing and utter despair. Without another word, Jedediah stood, his movements stiff and final, like a man already dead. He wrenched open the cabin door and stepped out into the raging blizzard without a coat, without a hat, without a single backward glance. He was swallowed by the swirling white darkness in seconds. Retired Sheriff Brody McCabe, who was a young, green deputy at the time, recalled the incident 60 years later in an interview. "We formed a search party when the storm broke a few days later. Caleb and Isaac Hollister, they helped. Quiet boys. Good woodsmen. We searched for a week. Covered every inch of that hollow. We found nothing. Not a single track, not a scrap of cloth, nothing. It was like the mountain just opened up and swallowed him whole. In the end, we had to file it as a weather-related fatality. Man wanders out in a blizzard, gets lost. It happens. But we all knew something else was going on in that family. The air up there, it was heavy with things unsaid. We knew we weren't just looking for a body, we were standing at the edge of something we couldn't, and maybe didn't want to, understand." Jedediah's disappearance was officially recorded as a mountain tragedy, another soul claimed by the indifference of nature. But inside the cabin, it was understood as what it was, a final, damning judgment. A suicide. The secret, now unearthed, was a bomb that had finally detonated, and the already twisted family structure collapsed entirely, and was a poison that seeped into Samuel's every thought, destroying him from the inside. How could he live with the knowledge that his very existence was the product of such a profound sin, that his blood was a mixture of shame and sorrow? A few months later, as the spring thaw once again began to touch the hollow, he packed a small bag with some bread and salted meat and walked away from Black Fork Hollow, never to be seen or heard from in Boone County again. The remaining family fell apart with a quiet, devastating finality. Caleb and Isaac, now burdened with the full, horrifying truth of what their father had done and what their sister had been forced to endure, could no longer bear to live on that tainted land. One by one, they left, moving west to seek a place where the name Hollister meant nothing, where they could build new lives free from the inescapable shadow of their family's sin. Willow remained. She stayed in the slowly decaying cabin with her daughter-sister, Lily, and her youngest true sibling, Sarah. She became the reclusive, spectral woman of local rumor, a ghost haunting her own home long before she died. Her face, still young, became etched with a grief so profound it seemed to have settled into her very bones. The Hollister homestead, once a proud symbol of hard-won survival, became a place to be actively avoided, the ground itself seemingly soured by sin. Children from other hollows were warned not to go near it, that the place was haunted, cursed by an ancient sorrow. Over the decades, the hard, specific facts of the tragedy, incest, shame, suicide, were too grim and too shaming for direct retelling. As Dr. Vance explains, this transformation is a crucial part of the story's survival. Communities, especially isolated ones, have a powerful, instinctual way of healing themselves by softening trauma into folklore. It's a collective coping mechanism. Incest and psychological collapse is sandblasted by time and euphemism until it becomes a story you can tell your children without traumatizing them. The specific sin is made vague, and the human perpetrators, who were neighbors and kin, are replaced by supernatural forces, which are easier to fear and condemn. And so, the story of the Hollisters began to transform. Jedediah became a nameless, grieving father driven mad by the loss of his wife. Willow became a tragic, unnamed, ghost-like daughter, eternally trapped by sorrow. Samuel became a nameless boy who uncovered a dark family secret and was chased away by an angry spirit. The horrifying core of the tragedy was clouded in vague, palatable phrases like, a family that got too close, or, a darkness that took root after a hard winter. After Willow finally died of old age, a lonely woman in a collapsing house, the cabin fell into ruin, its decaying timbers and collapsed stone chimney becoming a physical landmark for a ghost story. Hunters claimed to hear a woman weeping near the ruins on quiet nights, or see the indistinct shape of a man walking coatless into a snowstorm, only to vanish when they called out. The truth was too terrible, so the mountains, in their ancient wisdom, provided a more acceptable legend. The ancient, mist-shrouded forests of Appalachia keep their secrets. They are patient. They swallow homesteads, erase man-made paths, and muffle the sounds of human tragedy with a thick blanket of leaves and silence. The Hollister case, if it can even be called a case, is a haunting reminder of how the potent combination of profound grief and absolute isolation, when left to fester in the dark, can warp love into something monstrous and contort duty into a soul-crushing. Remember that the deepest, most terrifying darkness is often found not in imagined monsters or supernatural entities, but in the lonely, forgotten, and desperate corners of the human heart. The official records are silent. The physical evidence, the cabin, the barn, the lonely grave on the hill, has long since returned to the earth, reclaimed by the relentless, indifferent green of the wild. The hollow where the Hollisters lived and suffered and died is just another anonymous valley now, indistinguishable from 1,000 others. All that remains is the legend, a ghost story that grew from the seed of an unbearable truth, a folktale that serves as an unmarked tombstone for a crime too terrible to name. The truth of what happened in that cabin, the shame and the sorrow, no longer exists in any verifiable form. But it still echoes, not in words, but in the quietest parts of these ancient, knowing mountains. It is a story the land itself remembers.